Black Myth Wukong looks extremely cool. Combat looks fun and everything. It deserves all the hype it's getting because this is the #1 wishlisted game on Steam. I'm also personally still waiting for Silksong, but it is what it is. In this game, like, not only does the combat and stuff look really fun, but it is also visually pretty stunning. Like, this game looks incredible, and this is all running in-game, not just like some kind of trailer or something like that. And part of that is because the game is based on Unreal Engine 5. And it's probably the first game to use Unreal Engine 5 that actually looks cool, like one that's exciting. If you know anything about Unreal Engine 5, you probably get nightmare flashback. Your entire computer is about to explode just at the sight of Unreal Engine. This game is really hard to run. I have a $1,000 graphics card, and this thing can struggle to run ray tracing this game at all. And just running normal settings in the game without ray tracing, it still struggles to run this game. But it's funny because it seems like the developers know that people don't know if they can run the game properly. So they gave people a tool, a benchmark tool right here that you can just download for free, and you can test your system out on it. That is where I've been able to completely dig into this and just find the absolute optimized settings for this game. Yes, this game is very demanding, but there is ways to make it easier to run on your system and still not really lose that much the way that the game looks. And I've also tested out on an absolute ton of graphics cards. Yeah, I have been benchmarking for quite a while. Freaking 20 hours just in a benchmark is freaking wild. All right, we're in the benchmark here. All kinds of settings to dig into. So for the first one here, we've got display settings. Obviously, you can go at different resolutions. I can test at 4K, but I've tested everything from 4K, 1440p to 1080p. The only valid resolutions, if you're on ultra wide, tough luck, bud. You can see there's all kinds of scaling options. There's DLSS, there's TSR, which is temporal super resolution, which is baked into Unreal Engine. FSR, we've got XeSS, Intel's Upscaler as well. And the scaler is interesting. It's based on a slider, and you have frame generation from DLSS if you have a 40 series graphics card, or you have FSR, which is FSR 3.0 AMD's technology. This is available on way more GPUs and stuff, but I will tell you that this is only FSR 3.0 and not 3.1, which means it's not decoupled the frame generation from the upscaling. So if you are using the frame generation from FSR, you have to use FSR. You can't go to XeSS upscaling and use the frame generation from it. Maybe they'll update this in the future. I don't even know if they will. This game seems to be NVIDIA sponsored, and it has full ray tracing in the game. There's all kinds of other graphics presets to play with, so let's jump right in. But first, today's sponsor looks tiny and unassuming, but it punches way above its weight class. Ugreen's Nexode Pro 100-watt charger can deliver 100 watts straight to a single device, bringing a MacBook Pro 14-inch from 0 to 50% in just 27 minutes, while being just, what do you call this thing, like half the size of Apple's stinking 61-watt charger? This little guy is a beast. Along with the USB Type A and 2 USB-C ports, you can take that power and split it to 3 devices at once, at the same time, keeping all of your devices protected and topped up quick with Samsung Fast Charging 2.0 with many other fast charging standards. All your devices are covered. You might call a charger like this that is so compact and so powerful basically magic, but Ugreen was able to make this happen with gallium nitride technology. You can have that efficiency wherever you want to go to, and you can get 50% off. The links to Ugreen's 100-watt Nexode Pro charger in the description if you want to check it out. It's a great way to support the channel. Again, links are in the description. Let's go ahead and jump back into the video. So low, medium, high, very high, and cinematic. So you're basically watching a movie. And at cinematic, you're also probably getting cinematic FPS, like 24 FPS. And then for ray tracing, which we will go over, there is a low, medium, and very high. And you can combine ray tracing with these settings. And I'm not exactly sure all the settings that ray tracing overlaps. It seems like it'll replace the reflections, the shadows, and possibly the global illumination. So the first setting I want to talk about is the super resolution setting, and which one we really should be using. So you got 100%, right here. If we slow down this footage to 50%, I've actually been really impressed. So usually based off of a lot of other anti-aliasers, they do look quite different. And I've seen lately the FSR anti-aliasing actually looks quite bad. But you can see here, I mean, if we see this plant here up against this rock wall, it looks pretty much the same on all of them. I would say that XeSS looks a little over sharpened in this case here. Other than that, like, I mean, FSR is holding right up to DLSS and everything like that. Even the built-in upscaler, or anti-aliaser in this case, is doing quite well. You can't really go wrong quality-wise with any of them, at least for anti-aliasing in this game. The only thing though is when it comes to the performance of these upscalers, they can be quite different. So I'm on an NVIDIA GPU, at least for this test. We're seeing that TSR, the built-in one in Unreal Engine, is performing pretty poorly. DLSS was at 54. So that's a pretty large difference between those just for at native resolution. So you might as well get more FPS. And if they don't really look that different, then you're not really missing out and anything using DLSS if you have access to it. And then FSR is a little bit behind DLSS, at least on this NVIDIA GPU. And Intel's XeSS is about the same as DLSS, at least in anti-aliasing. Now, if we go ahead and drop down here to performance upscaling at 4K on the 4080 Super, you can start to notice some differences between these. At least on this still frame here, you can see this branch is kind of floating in the water, right? Or just hanging over the edge. On the left side, TSR and DLSS on performance mode, they look relatively similar actually. And DLSS, I would say, looks a little sharp in that kind of way. It looks like FSR on the right side of it is looking a little soft compared to DLSS. And then XeSS as well on the right side of the screen is looking pretty sharp as well. And in motion, they all look pretty similar. Honestly, I've been quite impressed by how all the upscalers look. They hold up pretty well against each other. And even in some cases here, like, it almost seems like, do you see this tree as it's passing by here? It looks over sharpened. Like, DLSS is reconstructing more detail and XeSS is reconstructing more detail as well, but they're kind of shimmering. And FSR is not shimmering in the way that those other ones are. TSR has a shimmering effect on this water, which I would say is pretty distracting, whereas DLSS gets rid of that. FSR has that problem as well, like TSR does. XeSS seems to also get rid of that problem. Both XeSS and DLSS are AI upscalers. They actually take into account machine learning for their algorithms, whereas FSR and TSR are completely just normal man-made algorithms to do this stuff. There is one thing there. Let's rewind it just a little bit. Let's slow this all the way down to 25%. You can see as this branch comes by, FSR has a lot of ghosting in here. Do you see how much it's trailing? Yeah. It doesn't hold up as well as the other ones, at least in this case. That comes up pretty frequently with FSR. I'd say overall the image still looks pretty solid compared to the other ones, and I'm quite impressed by how these all perform in this game, at least visually. The only difference here is like what performs the best, like FPS wise, on your personal system. What graphics card do you have? Which one is the best to run? And what I found is that TSR on basically every graphics card is the slowest one for it. Whether you're on an NVIDIA graphics card, TSR is far behind everything else. If you're on an AMD graphics card, the 7900 XT in this case, it's a little bit slower. It's actually about the same as FSR is. And then if you're on an Intel graphics card, it's slower than XeSS and stuff. You might as well just use whatever upscaler is with the same brand as your GPU. So if you're on NVIDIA, use DLSS. If you're on AMD, use FSR. That performs the best on its own graphics card, it seems like. Then if you're on Intel, use XeSS. It seems to be as simple as that. They perform the best on their own brand of GPU. Upscalers like just work like that, at least in this game. That is to note, the benchmark is pretty slow moving in everything. It's harder to see some major differences that maybe could come up in combat. I think the ghosting with FSR could be a pretty big issue in motion and actually fighting in the game and stuff. That could be quite distracting, but we'll see if it actually turns out anything like that. So far, I've been pretty impressed with it. But now we're off of the scaling. Let's take a look at the ray tracing, because this game is being advertised to have crazy ray tracing and stuff. And honestly, it's not as good as a lot of things are making you want to believe it is. The ray tracing presets were all at default high settings, and then the ray tracing preset is applied onto it to try to save on some performance, because if we ran this at cinematic, we'd be way less than cinematic frame rate. You can see on high setting, this is one of the major gripes with it. Even on an NVIDIA graphics card, this is native resolution at 4K, so you could do some upscaling. And we're looking at like 19 FPS on very high ray tracing on a $1,000 graphics card. You can see that's a much smoother experience on high settings at 4K, way more manageable. And upscaling, or maybe even using frame generation in this case, could be actually a doable thing. That I'm not really impressed that much with how this looks in general. We see here the water. So this is doing reflections in the game. On the left side of the screen, there is somewhat more reflections. Although without ray tracing, it doesn't really look that bad. It's actually just using screen space reflections in this game. Medium ray tracing, we kind of get this blurry mess here, where as on the left side there is reflections, but they look speckly, and that's because the ray count, there isn't enough of them to make a complete reflection. Whereas on medium, it seems to maybe even have even less ray count, and it seems to blur out whatever it's looking at pretty heavily. And then on ray tracing low, it seems like it doesn't use ray traced reflections at all in the game. I might be wrong on that, but I don't exactly even know what this is. Maybe it's just ray tracing the water caustics, which is the little ripples and stuff in the water and all that. This is one of my major gripes with it, because I don't think the ray tracing really looks good. I don't think it has a high enough ray count to look good in this game. I'm gonna freeze frame it right here. There is a reflection of this guy's torch in the water. Do you see these pixels? These like 3-4 pixels here? Because the ray count is so low, even on the very high ray tracing, you don't get a full reflection. And I honestly find that the speckled reflection in the game is more distracting than it is like nice to look at. You can see here the reflections on the face in the water just are very split up and like grainy and stuff on very high ray tracing, whereas in medium it blurs it out and it kind of makes the water look like it's ice. But one of the main reasons why they could look better is actually because this game doesn't have ray reconstruction. Because the ray count is lower in this game, what they use to make it look decent is actually denoising. And you take all that grain that is caused by the low ray count in the game and you try to make it look smooth and try to reconstruct some of the detail. And ray reconstruction is an NVIDIA feature that is actually compatible on all NVIDIA RTX graphics cards out there. It actually uses AI to reconstruct things with the ray tracing, and it does quite a good job. It can look a little bit artificial at times, but overall, you'd rather have it on than have it off. And sometimes it can also improve performance. I think it would look a lot better with ray reconstruction, and actually the DLSS version in this game is 3.7, which is compatible with ray reconstruction. It's just Game Science those are the developers, didn't actually integrate this into the game itself when they maybe could have to make it look quite a bit better. And I'm wondering why NVIDIA didn't push for this if they did sponsor the game. What we have is this, where I don't think the reflections in the game look all that good. But there are some things that are some upsides, and I think you can see this pretty clearly with this tree here. At all ray tracing presets, even at low, it does ray traced shadows. That helps a lot. And let's even back up the recording here. On all the ray tracing presets, because they are ray traced shadows, it is accurately ray tracing every single leaf up here and then casting a shadow onto this rock. And on the right side of the screen, with just the shadow maps and everything, it is pretty blurry. The shadow resolution is a lot lower. And when you actually get up to things, sometimes the shadows, once they draw in and everything, will look kind of shimmery, whereas ray tracing obviously has very stable shadows. You can see that. It just helps a lot with the shadows in the game. And another area where I'm pretty sure it's using ray tracing in this game is the water caustics. That's what NVIDIA at least claims. Caustics in the water are like the waves and ripples, and also sometimes the water crashing up against things and causing like white water. Caustics and stuff are ray traced on the left side, and you kind of see partially into the water, and there's like a fog effect in the water because of it. Whereas on the right side of the screen, you can kind of see straight through the water. It's cool that the game has crazy ray tracing effects, and NVIDIA is probably like, ooh, yeah, let's pump this feature into the game because we love ray tracing and all that. But I don't really think it's that important in this game, and you can probably go without it, especially if you're on an AMD GPU too. Good luck running ray tracing. Now let's get into the game settings to see how we can optimize these to get the best performance while not really losing that much visual quality. Okay, and the first thing that we're going to look at is the view distance quality. What the game says is this: adjust the rendering quality of distant objects. Choosing a higher level increases the detail and density of distance objects. Left side of the screen is cinematic max quality view distance. In the middle is high settings, and on the right side is low view distance. And then the baseline settings for this is high setting preset, and then just change each one overall. I don't see a major difference between each version of this, and I kind of think this is because the benchmark in the game is pretty like tight and you can't see expanses into the distance. This is probably the furthest point, and I still don't see a major difference with the view distance in the game. I'm wondering if when we get into the actual game, when it does release, if you're gonna be able to see further and this might come more into play. This part here is probably the area where it's going to be most affected. Usually you can see clear levels of detail where things, as they get further away, they become less detailed to save on resources and stuff. That's what view distance usually does. I might be crazy, but these look like all the exact same models on low view distance, high and cinematic view distance here. Let me know if you do see a difference, but I don't. One thing you can see a difference with, and I'm gonna zoom out a little bit, you see the FPS is actually about the same on all these settings, so it doesn't really change there. But I want you to look at the CPU usage percentage, which is right next to this 7800X3D thing on my stats here. On cinematic, it's at 20%. In high settings, it's at 12%, and at low settings, it's at 12% as well. Having the larger view distance of the game doesn't seem to really impact the GPU performance. It seems to be completely fine in this case, but it can affect the CPU performance. So if you have a fast graphics card that is capable of high settings, but you have a slower CPU or an older CPU, and if you're having problems with your frame rate in the game, turning down your view distance can probably help with your CPU performance in the game. In my case, I have a 7800X3D, which is literally the fastest gaming processor out there right now. Like, I'm not gonna run into any issues here, and this game actually performs really well with CPUs in general. We'll see when we get into the actual game and see if there's some major differences in the game, but at the moment, I don't really see any. Now, next up is the anti-aliasing quality, and this one throws me for a loop. So it says, by the game's definition here, it determines which anti-aliasing quality is applied to the game, which I find really odd. It doesn't really matter what you're on because, and maybe unless you're on TSR or something like that, all of these settings up here, the scaling, the super resolution, everything, all of these also do anti-aliasing to the game. Maybe it changes what quality it looks like they're at or something, but I don't exactly know why this is a setting. You can see on the left side of the screen is cinematic anti-aliasing, in the middle is high, and then on the right side is low. You would think if anti-aliasing was low or even off or something like that, then you see a lot of jagged lines and stuff, and that's just not what we see. The game, it's slowed down right now, and you can even see in motion there isn't really a difference between them. They have all about the same amount of instability, and also in terms of the performance in the game, it doesn't really change the way it performs. I mean, anti-aliasing, I wouldn't really worry about it, just allow it to go with whatever graphics preset you're going with. The next setting is post effects quality. Okay, so the game says this adjusts the quality of post-processing filters affecting effects, that's a tongue twister, such as depth of field, bloom, subsurface scattering, and ambient occlusion. So depth of field is like when things blur around a focused object in a scene or something like that. In the benchmark, we can't really see that much depth of field, if any. This will probably come up more in gameplay and in cutscenes and that kind of stuff. Bloom will also probably come up more in the game. We can see that a little bit here in the benchmark. Subsurface scattering, actually something that makes characters and stuff look a lot more realistic, because subsurface scattering is when below the surface of a skin or any kind of object, really, it reflects light inside of itself. And that means that it has like its own color and it can be kind of translucent looking, as well as ambient occlusion. This is when two objects and stuff touch each other and there's kind of like a shadowed edge on them. Let's slow it down to 50%. As we scroll by, let's see if there's any bloom changing on here versus the cinematic and all that. And I don't really see a difference on the fire there. In terms of ambient occlusion, you would think this would be a prime area where there's objects, the rocks touching and everything. They would have shadowed edges around them to help divine them and everything. Ambient occlusion doesn't seem to really be doing anything at all here. And there isn't really any subsurface scattering to witness in this benchmark. I mean, We could maybe see it with leaves and stuff, but I don't see it that dramatically here. So I'm wondering if post effects and stuff is really built for cutscenes and all of that, and maybe it could have a performance impact in cutscenes, because as we go through the benchmark here, you can see that the FPS between them is literally exactly the same. So I'm not even sure if this is really applying anything. It doesn't claim in the game that it's going to use a bunch of resources. So in my opinion, unless it does come up that cutscenes in the game heavily utilize this and it takes a huge performance hit, I would just max it out. I mean, I don't really see why not. Now the next one is a big one, and that's shadow quality. So here we can adjust the detail quality of shadows. Higher settings provide more precise shadow effects and increased shadow softness. Significantly impacts performance. Please adjust with caution. As we all know, shadows are hugely important to make a game look realistic at all and fit in 3D space. And you can even see here, just at the beginning of this scene, there's already differences with the shadow. You can see on cinematic quality, there seems to be more range to the shadows, okay? And even more detail hidden here, because we see that there should be a shadow. You see this little like support arch here on the left side. That should cast a slight shadow down here, and you can see on cinematic it is opened up a little bit, whereas on high it's kind of just blurred out, and on low it doesn't even look like these shadows exist yet. And I would particularly watch the low settings side here. You're gonna see these shadows start to appear on the low settings side, and here we are. You see this line, you get a clear distinct line where the shadows are starting to draw in, and I wouldn't say they particularly look good. We obviously get a lot more detail on the left side, but those shadows, as you get closer to things, do start to draw in on low settings. And I think this is happening because the shadow draw distance is changing on low settings versus cinematic settings and everything. So you can see settings, you can see shadows from a larger range, and I think that's very distracting on low, in particular as we come up here on this cliff side. So on the left side of the screen is cinematic max quality shadows in the game. You can see that there's more detail and more draw distance going on with the shadows. As you can see, this branches here, whereas on high settings it kind of just looks like a blurry mess. And as we get closer, even the high settings will start to draw in more shadows as we start to get in that distance. I think it's a lot more manageable on high settings than low. Yeah, you can see here that the high settings starts to draw in more. And on cinematic, it also draws in more. You can see there's a lot more detail with the shadows on cinematic as we get closer to this cliff face. But also the cinematic shadows can have a bit of a problem. And I think this is partially because they're not ray traced and they have a very high level of detail. And as we go by here, sometimes these shadows can shake and shimmer a little bit compared to the high settings and stuff, and sometimes look a little unstable versus high settings. I think overall it does look quite good here. I think it might be worth using cinematic shadows in this game, unless you are concerned about performance. You can see that cinematic is taking a pretty big performance hit. I mean, in low settings, you're not really gaining that much from going on low. So I would recommend going to high settings on the shadows, and maybe if you're feeling a little risky, you know, maybe jumping up to very high to kind of possibly split the difference. Let's go ahead and move on to our next one, and that is texture quality. High quality textures can help so much in a game. Adjust the texture quality to change the detail level of items, buildings, and characters. So everything in the game should look higher resolution with higher texture quality. We can see exactly that. I mean, just looking at this little statue here, there's a clear difference between cinematic, high, and low. Clearly, cinematic has a ton more detail. High is it does have some detail on like the bark here, the pillar, the wood pillar thing. And then the cinematic one has like more striations or whatever you want to call this. More detail, more texture. And that's really what we want in the game, okay? Even here, cinematic on this rock here, I mean, it probably even gets more extreme as you get closer to things, but this rock looks way more detailed on the left side, even compared to high and low. There isn't really a difference between the performance of this. And the VRAM usage with the texture is usually the biggest issue with it. As long as you have that VRAM, go and crank the textures, and most people have an 8GB graphics card, so I don't see why you wouldn't just crank up the textures a good bit. Maybe in different areas of the game that we will see, maybe it could end up using more VRAM in the future. There is maybe one caveat. Sometimes they need a lot of memory bandwidth for the graphics card to get those textures and decompress them in time, and having a faster bandwidth graphics card could help with that. And in this case, I do have a pretty fast one on the 4080 Super. It's a 256-bit bus. It's decently quick. That could be helping with this, not affect the performance that much. At the same time, I don't see why you wouldn't just crank up textures in this game. Most people are going to be capable of it. And that is something really good to see. Low VRAM usage, still get really high quality textures, all that stuff. That's sick. Next setting is visual effect quality, and says adjust the level of detail in visual effects, impacting atmospheric fog, cloud density, and particle effects. Significantly impacts performance, so please adjust with caution. The game tells you to be careful with this. And I just wanted you to look for the fog and all of that kind of stuff in the game. As we go into the distance, there's gonna be more fog. At different areas in the game, there probably will be more fog as well. I'm not gonna lie, the fog, at least in the distance, doesn't really look that different, at least to me. We saw that gray haze that was there. Didn't look that different. Let's look at the particle effects on the fire. Let's back it up just a wee bit. And we aren't really seeing a major difference on the visual effects there. When the actual game comes out, there could be quite a bit of like fog effects when you're fighting, and dust effects and clouds. That definitely could come up more in combat. But in the benchmark, I'm not seeing a huge difference between it. But like, this is an area where it'd probably be one of the most impacted areas. There isn't that big of a difference with the fog, even if at all. Obviously, these are clouds and stuff, and these should be affected by this. It could change how light shines through the clouds and fog and all that. It maybe looks a little bit different down here with the patterning with the fog down here. But overall, I don't see a major visual difference between them. If you want to save some performance, I would not hesitate to turn it down if it does look bad in the final game when it does release. Next up is hair quality. Adjust the level of detail for hair, and it significantly impacts performance, and please adjust with caution. Especially, I think as the game does come in, there's going to be more characters with hair all over them. You're going to see them closer with more and more detail. I'm kind of thinking that this could be more prominent of a performance effect. The most place that we can see this in the benchmark is just this fox guy who's just sitting here by the river here. On low settings, you can see that he visibly has less hair, so that's something to keep in mind. It seems like as you turn down the settings that it just turns down the hair count on things. Now, comparing high and cinematic quality here, there isn't that much of a difference, and I don't think visually it should matter that much. It probably looks just fine on high, even on different hairier characters that we might end up seeing later in the game. But you can see that we're only losing 1 FPS by getting to cinematic, at least in the benchmark. But in game, I think this could end up using quite a bit more performance, as we're seeing. I mean, the main character is basically a monkey, so there's quite a bit of hair on him, and we're going to be seeing more hair frequently. Almost every character in this game has hair. Because we're not seeing a very big visual difference between high and cinematic here, I would probably just go with high settings in the game. The next setting is vegetation quality. The game says it's adjust the level of detail for vegetation, which usually means as like a tree is in the distance or something like that, it's going to turn down the model detail to save on this. Now let's compare it in game. So on the left is cinematic, on the middle is high, and on the right side is low settings here. On low settings, there's definitely a lower level of detail, at least compared to high and cinematic. Cinematic definitely looks the best. This bush here with all the leaves, you can see there's just way less detail on this bush compared to high and cinematic. Cinematic is a pretty large improvement here. This bush that is present on both high and cinematic is just gone because the level of the detail with that setting just is gone. Now with the trees and stuff, they don't seem to be as affected compared to like the smaller vegetation and all that kind of stuff on the low settings here. I mean, maybe if you want to play this game competitively and the level of detail of all these bushes and stuff on the ground are bothering you, then maybe you could actually turn it off. You can see that there's a lot less detail on the ground that could be distracting to you. Something that I was hoping that the vegetation quality would fix would be all this grass and stuff here popping in. You can see on cinematic quality, there's actually a lot more grass on the ground as well. Because of the higher level of detail, that we wouldn't get as much grass popping in the distance here. The models you can see clearly pop up. But it still happens even on cinematic quality in this game, though it seems to be slightly less present, but you can see it pop in quite often just like it does on high or low settings. And the reason why I think they have this vegetation pop-in is because the game is actually based on Unreal Engine 5.0. And nowadays we're on Unreal Engine like 5.4 or 5.5. I'm actually not sure at this point. I probably should have looked that up. But the reason why we're getting vegetation popping and it can be pretty distracting is because now there is at least introduced in Unreal Engine 5.1, basically nanite technology, which basically eliminates pop-in and LODs and that kind of stuff, was actually introduced for vegetation. And you can use it for foliage and all that stuff in a game. Over time, Unreal Engine has fixed this, but when nanite technology was first introduced in 5.0, it was only really available for like objects, structures, rocks, maybe people and that kind of stuff. It really wasn't that widespread as it is now in Unreal Engine, hoping that the vegetation setting would up the distance for that, we'd see less pop-in. But it seems to be pretty distracting. I saw a pretty dramatic performance hit. Not insane, but a decently dramatic performance hit. Now let's hop into probably the biggest setting that is in this game. Global illumination. This is one of those settings that made modern games look as realistic as they do. And the lighting and everything looks really good nowadays because of global illumination. And what it says in the game is you can adjust the global illumination quality. Choosing a higher level can significantly enhance the lighting quality of scenes and characters. And that is dramatic, like it does look very different between each global illumination setting. So this is global illumination off in a game. You can see a lot of the detail and stuff looks kind of like not cohesive. It doesn't feel like a cohesive world. Like the shadows and stuff are just darkening the area around them. There isn't really colors reflecting off of things. Like in real life, you say you have green grass or something. The green on the grass is reflected onto the characters, is reflected onto things in the scene. The brown of these rocks or whatever these are reflected onto the scene as well. When you turn on global illumination, it looks like this. In this case, it's a little bit overexposed and he does fix this in the video. You can see that the shadow in particular here of the tree, that there is a part of a green shadow going on. You can see that the grass is actually reflecting the green onto the character itself. There's like green tinges to it because it's in the world. Things are interacting with each other and it makes lighting look so much more realistic. And that is why I tested this in so many forms in this game. I tested every single level of global illumination, turning off the very high one and the medium one. Let's just go back to what we had, cinematic and just high and low. The lighting looks quite a bit different on all of them. On low settings, this whole area looks a lot more flat. And here is just like a prime example of like what the fuck is happening. Okay, so on the right side, global illumination is on low, basically is like off. And you can see that it's just completely not lighting this fox dude correctly at all because his fur just turned into black. Like, what? That's not a bug either, it doesn't seem like. Maybe they could fix that, but yeah, that looks kind of weird. You can see that the water looks different with global illumination on the left side. So you can see that because global illumination is on the left side, it's actually taking some of that water, the greenish tinge that is on the water, reflecting it around in there, and it's making kind of a green tinge on the water. Whereas on the right side, the maybe this is what was happening to the ray tracing low before. It didn't have global illumination. It just looks kind of fake. I guess this is one thing that brings it more to life is like this character here is getting the light around him reflected onto him and actually filling some of the shadows on the character itself. Whereas on the right side of the screen, it looks kind of blurry here. And I think this is partially like compression and also zooming in pretty far into it. On the right side of the screen, he just looks really dark and kind of out of place. It's like they kind of took his model and just dropped him in there. One big thing that I noticed in this test is look at inside of this like archway here with global illumination, at least on high and cinematic, that they look like they're lit properly on there, is because it would be dark in there. But I'm thinking because that the light isn't being reflected in here properly, that the global illumination on low just looks, this looks so out of place and flat. It really does. It looks really flat and ugly. And that's where we can maybe start to bring in, because this one, even on medium, starts to look pretty decent. It's like kind of like on low that it's completely turned off. I would pretty much avoid low settings for global illumination at all costs in this game. It really looks bad. There's all kind of bugs you can go through. The only reason you'd ever want to go for it is because of the performance, which is a huge difference. This is probably the biggest setting in the game other than ray tracing that's going to affect your FPS. You can see on medium settings as well, like it fixes that problem with the Fox, dude. I would just really avoid low unless you're so desperate for performance. It's honestly pretty good, it seems like, and could definitely get you by. High settings would probably improve the reflections a little bit more in most situations, but honestly, medium seems like it's just fine, and you get quite a bit of a performance bump by going to medium global illumination compared to high or very high or cinematic. It's a pretty big difference between these. Reflection quality. Adjust the rendering quality of surface reflections and water reflections. This is a perfect benchmark to take a look at this because there's so much water in this. Honestly, just slowing it down and looking at it, and I think you guys would probably agree with me, there isn't a major difference between low, high, and cinematic quality reflections here. I'm wondering if we weren't at such an extreme angle that maybe we'd see more differences here, but they look surprisingly super similar. It'll probably change the resolution of the reflections. These are screen space reflections, so it's only going to reflect things that you can see on your screen. Yeah, you can obviously turn on ray tracing as well if you want to try those ray trace reflections in this game. I think we're going to see a lot more of this in the full game once we can run around more. There's probably going to be more shiny objects and that kind of stuff, maybe even mirror-like things in the game that reflections start to matter quite a bit on. But overall, in terms of performance, I mean, we're in a very reflection heavy area. Pretty decent performance hit by doing cinematic quality. I mean, we're at 52 FPS on average, whereas at high settings, we're at 54, and on low settings, we're at 54 average as well. I would just turn on high settings, take the balance. I wouldn't take the performance hit of doing cinematic. And that is all the settings that we can tinker with in Black Myth Wukong. The optimized setting preset that I was able to come up with here, and you can take some suggestions throughout the video if you want to tinker with a few more things, but view distance is on cinematic, anti-aliasing is on high or cinematic, really whatever you want it to be. It doesn't seem to matter that much. Post effects quality, cinematic, shadow quality, high, texture quality, cinematic, visual effect quality, high, hair quality, high, vegetation quality, high, global illumination quality, a big one, medium, reflection quality on high. And this can give you over a 50% to 60% performance boost, at least on the 4080 Super, which is the graphics card I tested on, but you might see even more or maybe a little bit less depending on whatever card you have. All being said, it's pretty impressive. As we went over too, the ray tracing in the game just doesn't seem to be that worth it. It just doesn't have enough ray counts. It doesn't have NVIDIA's ray reconstruction. If you're on an AMD graphics card, it's basically useless. It tanks your FPS so much. Yeah, you can compensate some of that with some upscaling, but I'd rather just not upscale as much and just start at a higher frame rate to begin with, because even the top tier NVIDIA cards can't do that much ray tracing. In terms of the upscalers and everything, I've been really impressed with them. I think they all look quite great. Just use the best one for your GPU, which is basically, do you have an NVIDIA GPU? Use DLSS. You have an AMD GPU? Use FSR. If you have an Intel GPU? Use XeSS. It's as simple as that. A lot of things we're probably going to see come up more into the game itself, but some of the ones that you can save the most performance on. The biggest thing is that global illumination. It changes the way they look. The game looks dramatically and changes the performance of the game dramatically. In terms of the other things would probably be the shadow quality. I would go with high settings on the shadow quality. Cinematic quality tanks your performance quite a bit, and honestly, it doesn't always look amazing, even at cinematic, so I would compromise and go to high there. Shadows on low looks way too bad that I would never compromise on it. The view distance, I would keep in mind if you have CPU performance issues, that maybe turning view distance down in the final game could help you out quite a bit. The vegetation quality, you can also save some on. I think high is also a very nice compromise in that case. It actually cleans up the environment a little bit, because maybe the level of detail in this game can be a little bit too much at times. It looks too good, you know, it's its own problem. And then there's the visual effects. Doesn't really save you that much. I would go with high settings on that. Yeah, basically there's a lot of settings in this game too that just don't really affect performance at all, and you might as well just max them out to cinematic, at least in the benchmark here. In the final game, things could change. In some scenes, maybe it could go really crazy, but in the ones that we're in, we can't really see a difference. I can also give you an idea of how some graphics cards can perform, and I'm realizing this is a freaking monster video. I don't know if I should make this one video. For just some reference, it is pretty hard to run this game. I'm just gonna show you the spreadsheet that I have working here. Probably bring this up in another video, but even a 4080 Super at 4K here struggles quite a bit. At 1440p on high settings, it can hold its own. So if you pay $1,000, I guess you can play at 1440p. That's cool, I guess. 4070 Ti Super can hold up well there. At 4K, expect to do some upscaling and that kind of stuff. The 4070 seems like it can handle 1440p quite well. You might want to upscale there. But in terms of ray tracing, all of these cards completely tank. Even the 4070 Ti Super, which is an $800 card, is on performance upscaling, it's barely holding its own at 4K. Though you can use some frame generation to get some of that performance back. The 3080 is just like the 4070. I mean, it holds on at 1440p, and you might want to use performance upscaling at 4K. 3070, because it is 8 gigabytes. I think we go over this in another video, okay? But there is an absolute ton of tests here that I do want to show you that I have in spreadsheet form at the moment, and there's a lot of ray tracing here. I think we'll save that for another video pretty soon, hopefully before the game comes out, and give you an idea if your GPU can run it. But this has been the optimized settings for Black Myth Wukong. It's all cool to see, and I'm excited for it. The game looks great in combat and stuff. I actually don't think the benchmark in the game really showed it off that well, except for that end scene where you see the temple. That's the best looking part of it. I think the models in the game also really look good, like the characters, like that fox character and stuff looked sick. They're really detailed, the designs are good. The only gripe about how the game is how the pop-in happens with all the bushes and stuff and the grass and everything. It's pretty distracting. I think that's probably my biggest gripe with it. Hopefully this helps you, especially for when the game comes out, and getting it working as well as you possibly can on your setup. So good luck to you, and have fun when the game comes out. I'm gonna see you in the next video. Peace.